Everybody, welcome to ACE Video Blog Part 6. I'm your host, Nick Lawrence, and I'm here with Donna Cuthbert from ACE, the Alliance for a Clean Environment, and we're going to be talking about the historical fatal flaws in Limerick nuclear plants, emergency and evacuation plans. Donna, we have so much information to cover. How would you like to get started?
Well, I think I'd like to start with 1980. They had a public hearing on Limerick's evacuation plan. Very much was learned at that public hearing that actually should have shut Limerick down. The major thing was that NRC had standards for nuclear plants for safe evacuation. And they were based on the population within 30 miles of a nuclear plant. They only wanted 500 people per square mile. In 1980, Limerick already had double the 500.
That doesn't seem very many people.
No, we
for that
already
amount
had
of
on
space.
average 1,000 people per square
Right,
mile
exactly.
in a 30-mile area. So it was far too heavily populated to have a nuclear plant here, to have safe evacuation. And NRC knew that. And so did our elected officials, because at this public hearing, all this evidence came out, and as a matter of fact, was reported in the Pottstown Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
And it was through historic records, we're going back and us reading over all these news articles and Freedom of Information Act materials that we got, that we realized that this was shocking. They should have closed down Limerick in the 1980s before it ever started operating, and before they finished construction. It should have stopped it in its tracks, the evacuation plan, actually. And why do we know that? We know that because there was a nuclear plant in New York being built around the same time. It was called Shoreham Nuclear Plant in New York. And based on the evacuation plan, that plan was scrapped.
They actually
Shoreham
stopped it.
Shoreham nuclear plant was scrapped, and what happened? Why was Shoreham scrapped but Limerick was not, when they were both too heavily populated to be able to evacuate safely?
Mm-hmm.
The reason is elected officials. New York elected officials spoke up for the public safety, and they said that we will not approve this evacuation plan. It won't work. We're too heavily populated. In 1983, GAO said, look, you can do that, local officials. You can say no to this evacuation plan, and they can't operate. They can't start to open and operate and jeopardize your entire region. And the fact is that was the local officials in New York, in fact, in Suffolk County, the county officials, said no. Almost unanimously in 1983, 1989, Governor Cuomo said no. All the elected officials were not going to allow you to approve this evacuation plan, and in 1993 they started to decommission Shoreham. So Shoreham was decommissioned, Limerick was open.
So when you say public officials, whom are we talking about?
We're talking about local officials,
local, state,
county officials, state officials.
So all of them were on board with this, and they had the information, but they still were on board and let it go ahead.
Well, here's an interesting question. That's a great question, because we had one local municipality who spoke up and said, no, we're not approving this. And it was South Coventry.
Wow.
Yep, Richard Whitlock in South Coventry. He was the head of the supervisors, and he said no way. But none of the other people joined him. No other local municipalities, nor the county, nor anyone else. So they were not approved. And at that public hearing, there was one elected official who spoke up and said, this is not acceptable. This is for industry profit. This is not protecting the public safety. And that was Congressman Ed Markey from Massachusetts, who's still a congressman in Massachusetts to this day. He spoke up to protect the residents around Limerick, but none of ours did.
It's just hard to believe that they know the information, they know the harms, the potential harms. They know that the evacuation plan could not have worked. It was based on old numbers, and it couldn't have worked then, let alone being able to work now.
That's correct. But there is hope, though, because Senator Casey, we contacted him, as did other groups in Pennsylvania, about worrying about this emergency and evacuation planning. And if you'll remember, in the Mercury there was an editorial and everything that this evacuation plan needs to be revised. It won't work. So what happened is in 2011, Senator Casey triggered another GAO investigation. By the way, I might show you here The GAO in 1983 said that the nuclear evacuation plans are deficient. They're not going to work. Well, the fact of the matter is, since then, there are few, if any, meaningful changes in that. So here we are in 2012.
30 years later.
30
right?
years later.
And it's still the.
And here we are in 2012. NRC actually pared down evacuation plans instead of making them better. So we're here like sitting ducks in a population. Look at this. I mean, at 4:22 on a work hour traffic. We'll never get out of here. It has to be closed.
Well, it's interesting that the plant has been aging for all of these years, right?
Yes, it's
so
aging.
Not only is the problem that they didn't do anything for 30 years, the plant's been aging, so the likelihood, I would think the likelihood of something going wrong now gets greater the older the plant gets, even though they do upgrades
Well,
and
that's
things
true.
like that,
We're
right?
going to do a whole series,
Okay.
a whole video blog series on the aging, because we've been reviewing the safety evaluation plan in the context of relicensing. And boy, that is another shocker. So we'll be doing that soon. However, the real issue about this population is it was double back in 1980.
Right.
We've had over 100% population increase since then. So can you imagine? Can you even imagine? It is just totally impossible to get out of here. There is only one thing for people to do, and that is contact every elected official you have, local officials, your state senators, your state representatives, and your U.S. senators and congressmen, and tell them that this plant has to be shut down. It's way too populated to be able to evacuate safely, and it could have been shut down back in 1980. But now it's time for these people to be responsible, because the threats have magnified. I mean, if your population went up 100%, you were double what was safe in 1980. That's just not acceptable. And unless people speak up, the problem is nothing's going to be done about it. And so...
Well, there were some people that spoke up back in 1980, right? They were denying the possibility, if I understand correctly, denying the possibility that there would ever be a problem with evacuation.
Yes, that was NRC.
Another one of our supposed protectors.
Oh, yes.
Right.
That was one of the most infuriating things I really came into. This NRC official actually got up at this public hearing and had the nerve to say that there would not be any need for people to evacuate from around
It would never
here.
get so bad that people
We
would have to
don't need an
evacuate.
evacuation plan, is what he said. There was a news article actually saying that we didn't need. Look, PICO official says the nuclear power plant didn't need an evacuation plan. This was at this public hearing, and when the fact is, he knew when he stood up and said that 1979, 1 year before he was saying that, right here in Pennsylvania, not far away from Limerick, we did need an evacuation plan. People had to be evacuated from there. He said no radiation would be released off-site from Limerick nuclear plant, when in fact NRC's own record said that that within a half hour, FEMA and NRC, if you look at that section of the emergency and evacuation planning, they say that within 1/2 hour of an accident at a nuclear plant, radiation can start escaping off site. And the worst part about Limerick is the fact that there more radiation can be released from a nuclear plant like Limerick because the containment is substandard at Limerick. Limerick's substandard containment means that there's more radiation would be released in an accident or meltdown. So those are things that really need to be evaluated. For one thing, we are only about 20 miles away from Philadelphia, the Limerick nuclear plant. Now, the fact of the matter is, back in 1980, there was a really wonderful woman who was an expert on nuclear plants and radiation, and she said, look, this can happen, and the Philadelphia region, there is no way, it's impossible to safely evacuate the Philadelphia region, which of course we would know that. But with 20 miles away, and back then NRC knew, they were saying that within 30 miles at least people would be impacted from this, and that's why they didn't want more than 500 people per square mile. So see all the things they knew, and yet what they say is something totally different. So PICO lied, and again, this time, it's about the very livelihoods, because if something happens over there, we're going to lose our health, our possessions, our businesses, our way to work, and we may not ever be able to come back. So it's worse than about the financial thing, too cheap to meter. Remember that line?
I remember it.
Yep.
So what about this idea of paring down the evacuation plan, where it should have been expanded? You're saying it's been pared down.
Pared down.
What does that mean?
That means that NRC now is requiring less, less ways that they have to actually prepare for this. And the worst part of those less ways is they don't even have to practice for a radiation emergency, which is ridiculous because that is the very thing a nuclear plant accident is about. Radiation. But now they don't have to practice for that, and they're not as much in a hurry to get people out of the
area
plume, out of the radio. They're not as much in a hurry. Why not? I mean, that's the worst thing.
On other shows, we've learned that every nuclear power plant emits radiation just because of its own existence. So now if we had an accident or something and there would be an escape of these things, how could anybody say that the stuff would not go off-site?
Well, they can't. I mean, that's just the biggest lie. We've too cheap to meter was proven wrong by the late 1990s when our electric bills were up to 55% higher than the national average. This was already proven wrong back in 1980 when they were saying it. There was documented evidence back then that this wasn't safe. So the only thing that's going to make any difference in this is for people in the public to call their elected officials and say, we won't accept this. This is unacceptable. It's not safe. We can't prevent an accident at Limerick. Limerick can't be made fail safe no matter what you do. And it's one of the more dangerous plants because it's just like the ones that exploded at Fukushima.
Does your website have the names of the officials that people can contact? Because that may be a problem for some people who don't really know who their public officials are.
Well, that would be a problem, except all they have to do is look it up online and put their zip code in.
Okay.
And you'll find out who your elected officials are. And the other thing that you might want to do is call us.
Okay.
We'll be glad, or contact us by the website. If you don't know who your elected officials are, we didn't put them all on there because don't forget, this impacts officials all the way from here, all the way down to Philadelphia and beyond, way beyond Philadelphia.
But people can contact you if they need to know who their local officials are, the people that they should write to or contact.
Absolutely. And we do have officials listed, an official address in the blog section of our website, but it's only for our regions. It's not for the whole Philadelphia region, which is impacted by this. So
the area around the plant for the evacuation, what is the thing about the 10-mile limit? That wasn't always 10 miles, was it?
No, as a matter of fact, that was my whole point in this. When NRC had, let's say, regulations that said they knew, in other words, within 30 miles that people would be harmed, right?
Yeah.
And then when we had Fukushima, NRC said people within our U.S. citizens that were in Japan within 50 miles needed to be, evacuated. And still today, we've still got a 10-mile evacuation plan. So that's the one thing. When you talk to your elected officials, say, no way, that this evacuation plan has to be at least 50 miles, not 10, because they already knew people within 30 miles back in 1980 would be harmed from this.
So in a sense, people could think that they're evacuating but still be in an area that is toxic, that they're actually in the area where the problem could be, but they would think that they were outside of it. We just have about 30 seconds or so.
That is exactly right, and it's very important that the zone gets expanded, not only for your health but your financial interests. So if you want to find out more about that, email the website.
And tell people what your website is so that they know.
It's acereport.org, and our email address is aceactivist@comcast.net. It'll be on the screen.
Well, look, we appreciate you watching, and stay tuned for other segments that are coming up here about this whole idea about the evacuation from the area. So we'll be back with our next episode.